Welcome to this strategy-rich edition of The One Thing podcast, hosted by Ron Sheets. On each episode, Ron introduces you to the amazingly successful entrepreneurs from his Rolodex who reveal the simple truths behind the one marketing strategy they rely on to produce extraordinary results. Each episode is guaranteed to expose you to a proven approach for producing high-value and highly profitable business. Welcome to this episode of The One Thing podcast.
Hey everyone, it's Ron Sheets. Before we jump into this podcast episode, I wanted to take a moment to prepare you or set up for what we're going to discuss in the podcast. It is a little bit out of the ordinary from what I normally do. One reason is that in most podcasts, I talk to guests in regard to specific strategy. What to do, how to do it in a business for marketing or advertising. In this episode, we're actually going to step a little ahead of strategy with principle. So without principles, you can't have strategies or tactics because they're all built upon the principles. I had the chance to talk with a pastor of a local church, which is why I wanted to set this up. It's rather out of the ordinary. What does a church do that we could learn from in their marketing and advertising? Well, I first became aware of this church years ago because of my relationship with Pete Lillo, as Pete and his wife Donna are parishioners of the church. And I've been to the church. I've seen it operate. It's a wonderful church. However, what caught my attention and interest that sparked this podcast was advertising, radio advertising specifically that they're doing, that I thought was very out of the ordinary for a business in general, let alone a church, which is why I wanted to take the opportunity to talk to the pastor about the church's principles as to what they were built upon, and then the strategies and tactics that they use in marketing and promoting their business. Because their church financially is doing very well, which I think is the big issue that you should pay attention to, is the results that they're getting from their principles, strategies, and tactics. So I would ask you, as you go into and watch and listen to this podcast, that we're going to talk about religion and we're going to talk about politics. And the pastor, Pastor Jeff Tauring, he is very articulate and very specific about his approach on religion and his approach on politics. And both of those may differ from your ideology on religion and politics. So going into this, I would ask you to suspend your maybe initial reaction or feelings to resist what you're going to hear in this interview because of the politics and the religion. So I'm asking you to set aside the politics and religion and look for the lessons in what we're talking about.
Hey everybody, it's Ron Sheets and welcome to another edition of the One Thing Business Podcast. As you will see, this is a little different. We're not coming to you from my studio for this podcast, and that is because I think it was important to bring you on site with this gentleman, who I'll introduce in just a moment. And normally in the podcast, I talk with our guests about largely strategy. What strategies, what one thing can they do in their business that elevates them, that they would never do without? Today, we're going to talk strategy, but I also want to get and talk a little bit about principle, because as we know, you first have to have the principle before you can have the strategy, and you can't have the tactics unless you have the principle and the strategy to have the tactics. So today, I am sitting here with Pastor Jeff Tauring, who is the pastor and founder of Liberty Valley Church. And recently, I heard some of Jeff's advertising on the radio, which we'll get to in a moment. And it really sparked my interest to want to talk to him more. Because as you're going to find out, this is a gentleman who approaches church like a business, which is why I have dubbed this episode The Business Behind Church. And this really became of interest to me many, many years ago when I was in Dan Kennedy's mastermind in his Titanium group, and I heard Pastor Nelson Searcy talk to the group about money, about the money that he was receiving on a per parishioner basis in his church versus the traditional churches. And that's really what sparked it many, many years ago. And then the dots got connected when I heard Jeff's commercials, and I thought that he would be a valuable resource for you all to hear. So, Jeff, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome, sir. And it's let's start with we're brought up, at least we are brought up. You know, our mothers teach us the two things that you never talk about publicly is politics and religion. And we're going to get to that in a bit. But why don't we start with a little bit about you, your background, because you're an entrepreneur who now also has started a church so many years ago. Why don't you give us a little bit of a background on your story?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't become a Christian until 1997. Prior to that, I owned a body shop building high-dollar street rods. So I was an entrepreneur. My father owned a body shop too. So he was an entrepreneur, I was an entrepreneur, and that expanded. But then you learn things just being in business. And there are certain things in business that work and certain things don't. But the shop that I had was always word of mouth advertising. Always the best advertising was word of mouth. So I never did actually any advertising. It just, the work would show for itself. And as long as you have a niche in there where you're not just doing everything, but if you can focus it down on a niche, which was street rods, generally 28 to around 60, then you have a different crowd that you're trying to gain.
Yeah, you have a different focus, but also a very laser focus with a specific crowd.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, niche.
Yeah, yeah. And then for you said you didn't get, what finally for you was the calling to get into religion, to become a Christian and spread the word?
Well, that's a long story.
Give me the short version, the Cliff's Notes version.
Right. So we weren't a religious family. My mom and dad were Fonzie and Pinky Tuscadero and the Greasers. So when I finally came, through certain events, brought me to look for the Lord. I thought the things that I read in the beginning were if this is true, and the things that I'm reading in Scripture or the Bible or things that I'm hearing, if this is true, then that ought to, that would cause a man to dedicate his life to it. Because if these things are true, and I had never heard that before, I never heard the gospel before being really 22, 23 years old, and I'd never heard it. Mm-hmm. So if that is the case and this is true, then it really does call for your devotion, your dedication, which then I ran with it and then felt the call to preach the same year that I became a Christian. Mm-hmm. So I went off to Bible college, got all Fs, and because there is a basic understanding of religion that I did not have. Yeah. We were about chasing cars and girls. So that's a drastic different life. So I read through it, I got all the Fs, and I walked out thinking, oh no. And then I just studied for another year and then started again and then graduated.
So when you were going through school, what you're coming from a different perspective than probably a lot of others in it. What were you finding about what it was that you were being taught? Did you find yourself challenging what you were being taught or accepting? I'm curious as to what your mindset was. You got all Fs.
No.
You're claiming it's because you didn't know.
Yeah.
I think there's something deeper.
No. Well, no, I did not know anything when I got started. But so my first year was Fs. The second year's was C minuses. And at that point, I'm taking it in like sipping from a fire hose.
Yeah.
So then the following year, it's a little better. But by my senior year now, again, I'm not in it for any purpose other than the truth. So by the time my senior year came around, I really wasn't making friends. So on the exams, I would put the answer that the teacher wanted. And then I couldn't help myself but to write the real answer in the column. And that would irritate a few people. Or I would just ask questions that I already knew the answers to, and that was against that particular denomination or that whatever it was. But I'm not interested in denomination. If I'm going to dedicate my life to this, it has to be the truth. unvarnished. And so, and that led me to understand independence. You need to be an independent thinker, searching the Lord, follow. We have Scripture that is the authority, truly, and so we're going to allow that to happen.
When you went to school to learn the Word of God and to carry it on to people, when you entered, what was your objective? Was it different than when you graduated? Because as Pete has explained to me, that coming out of school, you had an idea and a path that others that were with you in school were, no, you should do this. You should, I think if I may be speaking out of turn, but one of the things that Pete mentioned to me is that you should call your church a Baptist church. And you said no.
Right.
So
right.
do you understand what I'm
Sure.
asking? So share that. So where was your view and objective versus what they were coming out of? You learned it like a fire hose coming at you, but how did you absorb it, and what were you going to do with it that was different than what everybody else was going to do with it?
So I noticed through school years and just after that to put the Baptist name on the sign is you're limiting yourself, because then sometimes Baptists may have a reputation that there's Southern Baptists or snake handling Baptists, there's this kind of Baptist, but you're definitely limiting yourself to that. So if somebody drives by and they're saying, well, I'm not a Baptist, and that's for Baptist people. And at that time, I was not a Baptist either. When I just was lost. I just was a normal Cleveland kid. So I thought, well, why would I want to put something on there that may restrict growth by having this label? I mean, I am a Baptist, so and I tell everybody that, but there's no reason to have that on your sign to restrict growth. At the end of the day, if you go to heaven and you're a Baptist or a Presbyterian, that doesn't matter to me really anymore. So, but the people that I grew up with at camp really frowned on that, thinking like, you're a traitor, you're embarrassed to be one of us. And I said, well, I really don't care what you think. We're here to win. And so we left it off, and within the first year, I think, we went from 5 people to 35 people that weren't from other churches, which that's the way it normally goes. So if you look at different churches that come into the area, all they're doing is taking church people from one flock, and then they're moving them over to this flock. And my goal was not to do that, but my goal was to see, well, is God in this really? So, and the only way how I could be the judge of that is I want to take people who are blind and see if the miracle happens of them coming to the light. I don't want to take fish from other tanks who already see, because that's easy. That's just business. Better music, better carpet, better lights, better whatever. But to actually see blind people coming to the faith, only God can do that. So that was part of my motivation in doing that. I want to see if we can see unbelievers become believers.
Yeah. And then your choice of the name of the church, not having Baptist in it, but Liberty Valley Church. Did you have, with what you just described, not pulling or stealing from other churches, but getting, for lack of a better term, but getting virgins, religious virgins, who were lost.
Right.
Did you define who I wanted? Not just the people who were lost and hadn't found church, religion, or God, but did you consciously define, these are the people that I want to attract? Did you define that?
Not so much at first. At first it was, we'll just throw the seed all over the place and then see what grows. So it was a mass plowing, a mass seeding, and that's the way that started out. So no, it didn't start out with a laser focus audience. It was more broad.
How did it then become laser focused? Because in a moment I'm going to play the radio commercials that I spoke of at the start, but when did it become a laser focus? When did you finally, I hate to use the term figure out, because it wasn't like you weren't doing this for financial reasons. You had a very authentic purpose, but when did you have an epiphany or shown,
Right.
this is who you're for?
Yeah. So what it was a combination of things. One of the things was that our missionaries were coming off the field, and so we had financed a few different people in Bolivia and a couple different countries, and they were coming off the field. So we were debating, kind of praying about, well, what do we do with this, and that was sometime right before Trump was elected. And so we've always been conservative, we're typical, somewhat conservative. And I just felt like, okay, the country is bleeding. And there is something to do with our roots. So I've taken, if you ride on an old Harley, on a 70-some Harley or whatever it is, there's freedom in there, all right? And a person who doesn't ride doesn't understand that. There's just some kind of freedom in your mind. That's why you see most of the bikers are all of freedom in America, and they have this kind of mantra of freedom, because there is a freedom, and that has been in my soul from birth. Mm-hmm. So when the missionaries came off, we recognized that the country is bleeding. This is before COVID, before the rigged election in 2020. But we recognized something is going on. So instead of putting other missionaries out, we had a large meeting I put together about 12 men of the church, just to kind of commence what the vision would be. And we said, we're no longer going to send any money overseas. We're going to become missionaries to America. And we posted 2 very crisply ironed American flags in the background. We held the meeting, and I gave the vision of what was going to happen. And then COVID hit. So within a couple of weeks, we realized they're lying to us. Amy Acton is lying. And so this then becomes a spiritual issue, because we have political leaders who are outright blatantly lying in a way that is almost evil. So that we already were heading down this road. And what that did is that, first of all, confirmed that we're on the right road. But then it shaped the road a little bit more, because Jesus tells us to watch the trees. In other words, watch the nations. You're supposed to be geopolitically astute. You're supposed to have an international understanding when Jesus says that. And so we kept an eye on this global situation of a pandemic, and then shaped it. And then we took Bible scriptures that would teach people how to react in this situation. And so when COVID hit, before this, we were a typical church, 100 people, 125 people or something like that. And it was your typical, young church. Then COVID hit, and we had just finished the building. That was brand new. So we bought 20 acres of the farm, and we built a new building. And I think we were at that time close to, I think it was 300,000 or so in debt. And then COVID hit, and we went down to 30 people, including children. We had people that I literally told them, if you don't stop talking the way that you're talking with the nonsense, I'm going to remove you, because God has established something here. And if you're not for us, Jesus says you're against us. So, we didn't close. One of my deacons wouldn't even shake my hand. It was somewhat like this, but we stood our ground, because I just felt my ordination is from heaven. And come hell or high water, I'm going to be preaching the gospel from my pulpit. And I don't care if anybody comes or 3 people come. So we did. And the Lord blessed, the whole thing became large. So even pre-COVID, when we had those meetings, we were on the road, and the road began to be shaped. And now the river is kind of starting to pick up steam, and we're starting to carve ground within this river, and it's picking up more steam. So we ended up going from 35 people to 400 people. And again, it was the same mission. So it wasn't just a bunch of people from other churches. We had people that were coming, and they were unbelievers. You would talk to them, and how did you become a believer? And the answer really was pretty shaky. And so then they would become believers, and then we ended up baptizing 30, 40, 50 people. We outgrew the building. We put on balconies in the other building. We outgrew that, and so then we ended up building a whole other building, and one thing led to another, and now it's just blasting at the seams.
Yeah. So let me take a break here from talking with Jeff and play 2 radio commercials that Jeff has recently put out on the air that you will hear. Whether you agree with them or not, or whether you agree with what he's talked about or not, do not miss the message of what we're talking about. This is not about religion. This is not about politics. This is about business growth. So let's play the 2 radio commercials, and then we'll come back.
Vote no on issue 1. In the red, white, and blue, the land of the free, we have the privilege to vote, to elect people to office. A republic, a representative government. This is a bedrock of liberty. So, an absolute no on issue 1. Freedom for the family is a vote no on issue 1. In the republic, we don't appoint oligarchs. We elect representatives. If they do well, we re-elect. If they don't, we can vote them out. It is the American way, the American dream, and we intend to keep it that way. On November 5th, vote no on issue 1. This message is paid for by one of his footmen. I'm Jeff Tauring, pastor of Liberty Valley Church. Come and join us. In 536 BC, an unusual man, a man of wealth, came to help the people of God, King Cyrus. In 446 BC, another unusual man, a man of wealth, also came to help the people of God, Nehemiah, cupbearer to the king. Today, another unusual man, a man of wealth, has come to help the people of God, Donald J. Trump. He stands against the beast of Revelation 13, the globalists. He stands for liberty, for family, and for freedom. On November 5th, cast a vote to make America great again. This message is paid for by one of his footmen. I'm Jeff Tauring, pastor of Liberty Valley Church. Come, join us.
So as you hear, those spots are either going to resonate with you or they're going to ruffle your feathers. Regardless of which they do, again, don't lose sight on the lesson that's trying to be taught here, is that you are either for someone or for something, or you're not for anything. What is it the old adage is that you either stand for something or you fall for everything.
Right.
I think, and I'm not sure if that was a Jesus or a God statement, but that's always stuck with me.
Yeah.
So on your website, which we'll get to the address in a bit, you have on there a section that is what we believe. And they're very short paragraphs, bullet pointed, for no other word, but they're very specific about defining what you believe as a church. And I would deem them as your tenets, if you would. Mm-hmm. So with that being a very clear description of what you believe and defining who you're for, that's an area that a lot of businesses miss. And anybody that goes to Jeff's website sees it. It is something that you can model in your business. But with that said, let's talk about more now the strategy that's built upon the principles we've just talked about. So what's the strategy for the church's growth as far as, because you're doing something that most churches don't. You're advertising, you're marketing, you're communicating, whereas many churches grow, as you said, by word of mouth.
Right.
And they rely heavily on that. What are you doing? If you can share with us the strategies and even some of the tactics of what you're doing in order to get your message out, in order to attract people.
Right. So Jesus said something that I think was eye-opening to me when he said, the children of this world are wiser than the children of light. And I felt like he's talking to me, because prior to the strategy implementation, it was just broad sowing of the seed. So I'm out there banging your head up against the wall, trying to just sow tons of seed and with not much production. And so once we honed down and had some strategy, there's another verse that Jesus says, cast not your pearls amongst the swine. So some churches will leave their what do we believe statement of faith very vague. You really don't know what they believe. It all just sounds pretty. To where with us, again, Jesus says, I have not come to bring peace. I've come for a sword. Which that is like, we don't want to say that, but that's what he said. He said, I'm a divider of men. Because if you're going to tell the truth, the people who don't believe the truth aren't going to like you. So we developed that in our strategy where we're going to put our message out there, but we're going to amplify what our message is. And so we say this all the time when people come to church. You either love it here or you hate it here, because there's no blurring the lines. This is what our message is, and if you're either for it or against it, just like Jesus said. Mm-hmm. So that's how we developed more strategy.
So, to oversimplify the situation, church by the uninformed, not knowledgeable about church. Church is about God, or going here and worship God. Right. But in your words, people are coming here for more than just God. Because they can go to any church and get God.
Yeah.
What are your people coming here for that is beyond just the, as we in business call it, the deliverable?
Right. So some churches would be what they call seeker-friendly. They are trying to attract people, so they will adapt themselves to be seeker-friendly. And they will water down the gospel, or they will take verses that they won't teach on Scripture that are offensive. We're the opposite. So we just give it unvarnished. We think that the product of the Word of God is perfect. We believe strongly that the product is fantastic. So what we'll do then is we'll give that out. And then especially men can see through watered down things. Mm-hmm. Strong men, so masculinity. They want to hear the unvarnished truth. They don't want sugar-coated stuff. So our message is, this is God who He really is, unvarnished. But the niche that brings it in is I bring in, my niche is the Old Testament preaching. So you can shed light on the New Testament and Jesus' teachings. And you can put spotlights, laser-focused spotlights, by teaching the Old Testament that Jesus lived in. Most people they forget that Jesus lived in the Old Testament. So the Gospels are recorded, they're written in 60 AD in the New Testament. But Jesus' life, He lived under the law. He lived in the Old Testament. So if you don't know the Old Testament, you're walking into the New Testament blind. And in the Old Testament, politics and religion, the two taboos, that's what that is. The whole Old Testament is politics in the kingdom. You have good kings, bad kings, good administrations, bad administrations. Here are the scenarios that happened during those administrations. And then you have a prophet literally talking for God. So God is speaking to this political administration saying, you're doing something wrong. And this is what's going to happen if you do that wrong. Or if you turn and you do this right, this is what I will reward you with. And the whole Old Testament is all these illustrations of basically politics and religion. So if you learn that, and as my niche, I see people out there that are constantly, I see something is wrong here in our country. I don't go to church. I'm not a religious person at all, but something is drastically wrong. And so I can take them through whatever passage of Scripture, and I can say, does this look like what it looks like to you? And the parallels are obvious. So then what happens is so I had a person that came to church from one of the ads, on the radio. And he said, I hear your ads on the radio. And I said, oh, okay. And he goes, I want you to know that I am not a religious person. I am not a religious guy. And I said, okay, because you're in church, And he's like, okay. So I said, oh, fine. The following Sunday, he comes back and he walks up to me afterward and he said, hey, I just got to tell you that I am not a religious person, but your politics message is just right on the money. He doesn't realize that I'm teaching the Bible. All he knows is that I'm making the connections between current political events, geopolitical events. He knows those, but now he's making the connection for the first time in his life with biblical things. Like, there are biblical parallels here. So by the third week, he comes walking up forward with a visitor tag written out that says, I need to be born again. Oh, I thought you weren't religious. And now you're saying that you want to become a born-again Christian. Because that is the unvarnished product. If you just show without being ashamed, without trying to hide, if you're not afraid to offend people, because you're gonna, we're for Trump. We don't make any bones about it. But if you're anti-Trump, well, we just offended you. Well, okay. That's okay, because we have to realize we're focusing. There's 11 million people in Ohio. You break it down in the cities, and you're looking at 30,000 people in one city. Well, a big church is only 5,000 people. Oh, our state is 11 million. So the reason that is you could just waste your time on just hitting all these, trying to get 11 million people. But if you focus down to there's a certain clientele that know something has gone wrong here. And I happen to have the answer, a biblical answer that is just true biblical answer. I know that they want it. All I have to do is make contact with them, and that will be the spark.
People hear you, they hear the word, and I want to get into the advertising. They hear it, they connect with it. It's like I ask people, how do you know you're in love? You don't. You just feel it. And that's a very simplistic example of what I believe that you're talking about, is that you're authentic about what it is that you want to provide to supply the need, and that the people are there, and your message connects with their needs and desires,
right?
And they know it instantly, as Pete's talked about.
Right.
Now, with that, give viewers and listeners. So, as a church, you do something that virtually no other church does. You advertise. If you could run us through, what do you do? What are all the different things that you do in order to get your word and your message out to attract people to come?
What venues we use?
Yeah, so you're on the radio. You're doing actually radio advertising,
yes.
Which, my gosh, how many churches are doing you're buying radio time.
Yes.
But what other things are you doing to reach the people, advertising-wise? Is it mail?
It's mailers.
Okay.
Yeah. So the big thing is you have to get out of, for us anyway, it's our echo chamber. You have to get outside of the echo chamber. So again, Jesus said, "You're the salt of the earth." And the country boy, because a lot of people have the adage, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And the horseman says, that's foolish, because you can make a horse drink by giving him salt. So when they were building 77 in the early years, when they were first putting in the freeway from Cleveland to through Independence, down through the hill, through the valley there, they had big, huge salt blocks at the top. And the horses, as they were pulling and working, could smell the salt and would make them drive these huge wagons up the hill and dragging dirt and carrying dirt through before. And it's the same principle that Jesus taught, right? So salt of the earth, you can make them thirst if they're just by giving them salt. So when we first started advertising, it wasn't for me. I actually was funding advertising for my pastor in the late 90s. And he was a really good Bible teacher and a really excellent preacher. But nobody came to hear him. the church was a large church that was 75% empty. And I thought, this guy has an excellent message, but Jesus himself could be teaching here, and it wouldn't matter because there's nobody here to hear him. So I did my first thing. I sponsored the traffic and did it on country music because the pastor was an old country boy, and he who went to Denver. He owned horses here. He came back to Cleveland, and he's lived on a ranch and he had this genre of, this was him. He's a cattleman. So I thought, well, we're going to advertise to that specific audience of country music, and that it didn't really pan out, but it was the right way. So then I studied it more, and I read through a very dry transcript of 1947, the Intelligence Committee of the United States Senate. Dry reading. But it talked about the study of propaganda, the art of propaganda. You can feed someone the perfect amount of information, but if it doesn't reach their heart, you lost them. If it doesn't touch their emotion, you lost them. I don't care how perfect and accurate it is. It can be as perfect and accurate as the Bible. But if it doesn't have the salt, if it doesn't have the humanity aspects, if you don't touch the human, Jesus says, what should you do with salt that has lost its savor? It's good for trotting under feet. It's good for nothing. That's the key. And I learned that through that long transcript. And I've also studied other propaganda, just because the early 1700s, I'm a student of the Revolution. Most people don't realize that the pamphlets that went around through the Federalist Papers and the pamphlets of Ben Franklin, Philo Publius, those were anonymous papers, but that turned the country. Mm-hmm. That absolutely changed the countryside. Yeah. And so, again, it's the same thing. It was propaganda that changed because it touched people's heart. It doesn't take a broad majority, but it takes a relentless minority setting brush fires of freedom in the hearts of men. That touches the heart of men. Right. And when I first did my own things, the radio, the fish, I'm the fish. And the salesman came out, and he expects a radio advertisement, He expects, like love and love and love and love and love. And I said, well, here's my spot. Here's my recording. And he goes, oh, we can't air that. And I said, why not? And he goes, well, let me show you what we're looking for. And it's this like happy music, family friendly, and all this joyful stuff. And mine was, it was Patrick Henry. Mm-hmm. This country is not built on religion, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the preamble to give me liberty or give me death. Yeah. We can't air that. Well, it turned out that he needed money. Yeah. So he says, I'm going to run this through, because he's a salesman. Mm-hmm. He wants, he's close the deal. See, I'm going to run this through. If nobody catches it, we'll be fine. Yeah. And I said, that sounds fair. So we ran it through, and we got a ton of response, positive response. I mean, a ton. So then somebody else, because you got out there now, so you got the attention of somebody else, and somebody else calls and says, hey, I heard you on the radio. Are you interested in doing a full half-hour broadcast? Yeah. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't have any equipment or anything. We have no money. We have no nothing. He goes, well, maybe we should do something to get you started. And I said, okay. So we did 1 half hour a week on a station that very little listeners, and it was during a time where absolutely nobody is listening, mm-hmm. but a couple. But we got our feet wet, and what it does is it focused us on, now there's this crowd. You have a niche, and this is now not, as Jesus said, you're not casting your pearls amongst the swine and wasting your time. And then it began to grow. And so then it went from 1 day a week to a different time slot to 5 days a week. And then it got picked up by another station that was over 100,000 listeners. And my radio announced, my representative said, I don't know if it's walking on water, but it's certainly something darn close. So I said, well, hey, the Lord is opening the doors, we'll take it. But then what happened was we honed it, because you learn, like, okay, this is what's happening. And then because we go out on bike runs and things, and people don't expect the preacher to be at a Harley run. Some people don't recognize me in a suit. They only know me in shop clothes. Then there's other people who don't recognize me. They don't ever. It's like there's two different things. So I could be there and they'll hear the name now, the voice. They'll hear my voice because it's become so familiar on the radio that you don't. It's working. Even the tagline. I was standing by somebody and his back was to me, and we were talking. And our tagline in the ads are, "Come and join us." But you can say it like, "Come and join us," or you can say, "Come and join us." The guy heard my voice, didn't see my face, quoted the commercial out loud. "Come and join us."
You know you.
He goes, "Is that you?" And I said, "Yeah, that's me." He goes, "You're the preacher?" And I said, "Yeah." And I'm in full, head. I'm out on the bike, so I'm in leathers and everything too. And he goes, "That's you?" And I said, "Yeah." He goes, "I'm coming to your church," and showed up the next Sunday.
Yeah. So they connect with a message, and they connect with the person who's delivering the message, which is not that far, and I'm far from a preacher or whatever, but it's not far at all from what Jesus did, and you're doing the same thing to reach a specific audience. So let's get to the part that you never hear at all talked about for churches, is that how does this translate for you in donations, in money, in growth? I mean, it's apparent on the expansion and growth of your church, is that I look at the congregation that you had here today, and I ask myself, I've been to churches, I've been to Catholic churches, I've been to Protestant churches, I've been to Baptist churches, I've been to all kinds of different churches, and I ask myself, how many of those churches would love to have this size of a group, hear them deliver the gospel of the Lord, not for the ego, but just because you're making a difference.
Right.
So from the money standpoint, if you're comfortable, and I don't want numbers, because you're a nonprofit organization, but I want numbers. You can't grow to where you've been without the money. What are the results? What have the results been from when you started to where you're at now with this amazing house?
So people are looking for leadership. They are starving for it. I mean, that is in a lot of different venues or different, they're looking for someone to take the lead. And so you're interested in being successful. We're not interested in the money. There's nobody here on staff. There's nobody here at this good-sized church that is on full-time staff. So I still work in a backyard garage to make my money. My associate, he works selling rims in sales. So, and we're the only two people who collect any kind of pay, but it's less than poverty. Let's just leave it like that. So I work in the garage. But because of the strong leadership, when we were outgrowing the other building, there was standing room only. So I said, hey, let's build some balconies in this thing. Mm-hmm. And so my father-in-law and we just looked, and kind of designed it in our mind, and we thought, well, we'll be able to get this many more seats in the building, and it'll be helpful to build balconies. But there. The steps of the good man are ordered of the Lord. You can't deny that. And I've been in the business now serving the boss for almost 20 years, and you just learn things. It's a humbling position, a privilege to be able to see the boss work. And this is how that worked. So we had a meeting with my associate, and we came together, and he goes, well, how much do you think this is going to cost, these balconies? And I said, I think about $25,000 a piece, so we're looking at around $50,000. The following Sunday, somebody came up to me and said, I'd like to give a donation for the balconies. And it was $50,000. Okay, that's just the old building. that's just small. So then when we talked about, well, we're going to do this, we're going to start this other building, and it will be about the building now will in phase 1 holds 1,000 people, but balconies are already in the drawing, so we're looking at somewhere around 1,500 to 1,700 people in auditorium. The bid for that, if somebody were to build that, is right around $10 million. I had a tremendous what we call the geriatric team of men, about 7 elderly retired men beside myself, built the building ourselves, so it didn't cost nowhere near $10 million. But this is what happens. So a gentleman comes to me and he says, I'd like to meet you for lunch. Now I'm busy because I'm working full time, pastoring a church. Now we're starting a building project, so I'm running 70, 80 hours a week. And the guy says, I want to meet you for lunch. And I said, oh, well, who are you? He goes, well, I don't come to your church, but I'd like to talk to you. And I said, well, I don't know. He goes, well, I'm a radio listener, and I learned a long time ago from King David to go in and out of the people. When I do homeless ministries, sit with the homeless people, listen to what they have to say, serve them. Forget who you are, serve them. So this guy calls and says, I want to do lunch, and I said, fine. And we went out for Panera, and we talked for a little bit, told me a little bit of his story, and then slipped me a check for $100,000. And I said, oh, and I came back, and you tell the people, we haven't even really broke ground yet, and the money is starting to just pour in. And so we had several people that they just said, I can't believe you say what you say on the radio. I can't believe that you mix politics and religion. And then you say it in a way that is so unvarnished that the lawyers are getting kind of spooked over at some of the radio stations. And he said, but I appreciate what you're doing, and so here's a check for $50,000. And that happened several times. This whole project then will be out of debt within 6-8 months.
And how long has it been from inception to where we are today?
It took us a year to build, and it's been open since July 4th. It was our first service. So what are we, October 1st, I think, or November 1st?
July, August, September, October, 4 months.
4 months, yeah, and the whole thing will be debt-free within less than a year. Then the work will begin in full steam, because I think that and so we do, like you asked about other things besides radio, podcasts. We have an IT department now that is growing so much so that we have our own servers, so that no one will be able to shut us down if it gets that big. So what happened to like Twitter or whatever, they shut down the servers. We'll have our own servers. So we plan, if God blesses, to become such a massive powerhouse that everybody in the community will know. So it's also mass mailers. So we'll, you not only do your laser focused things, but then you also now can do the broad,
Yeah, now you're into, rather than strategic marketing or tactical marketing, you're now in, or advertising, you're now into marketing. It's spreading the message, and many people confuse advertising and marketing, and they're not synonymous and so forth.
Right.
So agree or disagree with me on this statement, is that a long time ago you made a decision going forward as to what your message would be to your specific audience. And you said this in one way or another earlier on in our conversation, is that if they don't come here, they're going to go someplace else, and that may not be right for them, and they're going to then go to someplace else,
Right.
And I think the business lesson in that is that, as I said before, you either stand for something or you fall for anything, is that it's apparent you're committed to your purpose, and it doesn't matter what gets in your way. And it was apparent it didn't get in your way early.
Right.
It gets in people's way early, and they try to conform. They become sheep.
Right.
You didn't waver. You stuck to your guns, on where you were going and where you were taking this. Your message was clear here, you communicated it, and it brought people.
Right.
So the message, the big message for businesses is you have to really know who you're for and really become laser focused and clear on communicating that message in order to attract it, rather than being worried about how am I going to be judged.
Right.
Rather than, because as you said, people are looking for leaderships. They're going to find their way here, or they're going to find their way someplace else.
Yes.
And you, either way, you don't care. What I mean by that is that if they find their way here, then you've accomplished your objective. If they find their someplace else, that's okay too, because then they weren't right for here.
Right.
Is that, would that be an accurate statement?
Yes.
Okay. So I have two questions, and I thank you for your time. The first question is, when you set out originally, did you see yourself then where you are now?
I wasn't overly confident that it would achieve the goal, but I saw it. Yeah, I had the vision of it. Only because it was the same business tool. Like you said, it's not necessarily religion. It's the same business tool. So I had a business mission to become a millionaire by the time I was 30 years old. In building high dollar, it was 6-figure hot rods. So you're looking at one car that's $125,000, and you have this, and you have a plan to execute that you will accomplish that goal. And so I was well on my way to that before I sold out, or halfway sold out. So I would just implement the same thing. So we're starting out with 5 people, but I can see on the horizon this could end up, if we implement and if you're diligent. So and I don't mean to draw out the answer, but I just recently am reading the autobiography of Ben Franklin. Mm-hmm. And Ben Franklin had a difficult time with the faith because he was so educated that his Presbyterian preacher was not educated enough. And it made him shipwreck because he just felt like the guy doesn't study or he's not zealous enough or whatever it is. So he left. But get this, his father put in his mind to recite and memorize one of the Proverbs that says this: the diligent man will stand before kings. Diligence. You have to be diligent. So he wrote that when he was young in his memoirs, reminding himself as he was just starting out his first printing business. He didn't even have all the printer, but he remembered what his father said. So he remembered Scripture, even though despite his faith was struggling. He was walking away from the faith, but he had that Bible verse in his mind: a diligent man stands before kings and not before the mean men. He wrote that in his memoirs. He made a comment about that later on in his later years regarding his early writing. He said, actually, I've stood before 5 kings, and I've sat and had lunch with a 6th. It's diligence. If you are diligent, God says, I am a rewarder of them that diligently seek me. So in the beginning, I was definitely locked into being diligent and faithful, and could see that the general fruit of that would be the diligent man stands before kings. That's what the Bible says. Now, will I accomplish that? I don't know, but I can tell you that I can accomplish being diligent, and then the work plays out. So that's probably would be the mark for that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. That's excellent. So in conclusion, if people, watchers, listeners want to learn more about you, about the church, about what you do, and this goes to an international market, so I can't necessarily say that people are going to want to come, but there are people that may. How do they find out more about you, find out more about the church? Where do they learn more?
The name of the radio broadcast is Time in the Vineyard. Of course, Liberty Valley Church website, libertyvalleychurch.org. But then the political activism, which is our statement, Our mission statement is the churchmen and the statesmen combine. That already is going international because of what's happening in the Middle East. So I have taught the biblical understanding of current events on the ground in the Middle East through Scripture. And that has had a large order, or a few listenership, in Lebanon, just north of Israel.
Wow.
So that's where it can be found, and then the YouTube channel, I think, is one of his footmen where you can watch the videos.
Good. And I would encourage people, and I'll post the resources that he spoke of. I would encourage people to go and study it. Just last week with our mastermind group, I spoke to the group about the importance, and you just hit upon it with Benjamin Franklin, about the importance of studying and understanding history, because we're really not living anything new.
Right.
And what was done will be done again.
Yes.
And we can learn from it. And in a business sense, I see that there's so much forward thinking and not enough backward thinking.
Right.
To understand where we're going and what to do.
So you're becoming the preacher, quoting Solomon. There's nothing new under the sun.
There is nothing new. So, Jeff, thank you very much, sir.
Yeah,
I appreciate your time.
I hope that you gained as much out of that interview as I did. It's a little longer than what I normally do in a podcast, though I wanted to touch upon every subject I could while I had the time with Pastor Tauring. Now, there is a lot to digest from what we talked about. So as an adjunct or an addition to this podcast, what I've done is I've jumped back into the podcast and dissected it. I've dissected out the religion and the politics to really get to the lessons, the business lessons that will really be important to us as entrepreneurs. So if you're interested in seeing my post-podcast wrap-up, if you will, email me at info@rjmediamagic.com. That's info@rjmediamagic.com, and I will send you a link to see the video of my post-podcast wrap-up, where I dissect out what we talked about and really bullet point the specific business lessons that we discussed in this podcast. So again, if you're interested, info@rjmediamagic.com. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in. I'm sure you got a lot from this episode. Join Ron and his next guest here on the One Thing Podcast.